The fourth round of the 2024 Formula 1 season would see the sport travel to Japan and Suzuka, or as Charles Leclerc puts it,
"Welcome to Suzuka. I'll be driving the track around."
Anyway, Suzuka would be appearing on the calendar a lot earlier than we've seen it in the past. It's bumping up the order down to reducing the sport's carbon footprint and minimising the typhoon risks that have plagued the region in the last few years. Given we're forecast a whole boatload of God's piss on race day, that already looks to be aging like a typical FP1 video. Speaking of, hey there guys, I'm Will, welcome to FP1 and the Comedy Review, the show that proves men who live in their parents' basements really do know about Formula 1. Yeah, why did I let my audience do this again? As usual, we've got a hell of a lot to break down here, so let's not waste any more time and roll that title card. There's never a dull week in F1 news this season, and the run-up to the Japanese Grand Prix was no different. We kick things off with more staff members at McLaren deciding that they didn't want to be staff members at McLaren anymore. David Sanchez was first to go after just 3 months in the role of what he thought was technical director. When he found out he'd actually been assigned to give Lando Norris his daily hand job, he decided it was time to go. I've made a slightly more serious video on this if you want to know the actual reason. Well, slightly more serious anyway. This is still me after all. 5-time Le Mans winner Emmanuel Pirot was next out the revolving door at Woking. He was in charge of nurturing the team's younger development drivers, so a wanking joke is probably a little more inappropriate here. The team were adamant though that nothing was wrong whatsoever, despite Andrea Stella now reportedly on janitorial duties. In other news, Logan Sargent would be back after his Williams team benched the American and put more faith in the guy who just rammed his FW46 into the lake at Albert Park. You'd think things couldn't get much worse for Sargent, but upon patching up Albon's old chassis, they're still not letting him have his old car back, presenting him with the repaired one instead, and putting Logan in contention for the FP1 Cuck of the Year award. The worst bit about this has to be how the team are trying to justify it, claiming it would take too long to revert the car back to Logan's original setup, which surely is just removing the front wing and suspension. I really don't see what's so hard about that. Finally, as we gear up for first practice, there was more news surrounding the now vacant seat at Mercedes in 2025. Now, most people are touting either Carlos Sainz or Kimi Antonelli for that job, while you've got a few special people who still think it'll be Max Verstappen. And then there's #Blessed, who himself couldn't care less as long as it's not Fernando Alonso. But on Thursday in Japan, another man threw his hat into the ring. Sebastian Vettel has been taking a break from his vegan, recyclable, anti-global warming trans activist beehives to say hello to the British media. He then proceeded to cause an absolute frenzy when revealing how he'd been in talks with Toto Wolff and missed bits of the Formula 1 circus. Upon hearing this, many people opted to jump on the Vettel to Mercedes bandwagon, but I was sat there thinking, why bring all this up now? He's got a new energy drink out, that makes a lot more sense. Let's get on with FP1 then. Max Verstappen recovering from his DNF in Australia to top the timesheets at the end of the first hour on Friday. Traffic was aplenty in Suzuka, Yuki Tsunoda adopting his teammate's approach as he crawled out of the pits, much to the frustration of the Haas cars behind. On the subject of Daniel Ricciardo, he wouldn't be in the car at all in FP1 as it was handed over to Ayumu Iwasa, making an all-Japanese lineup at RB. That said, Alex Jakes really didn't need to word it like this.
Daniel Ricciardo is given the morning off to the delight of local supporters.
The Aussie will be getting a new chassis for the next round of the championship in Shanghai, in a bid to prove that he isn't as shit as everyone seems to think he is. As we're on the subject of chassis, let's check on never mind, he's in the wall again. In a rather awkward turn of events, the American took his newly patched up Williams car and decided to perform an extra crash test through the Dunlop curve. With James Vowles off to fetch his shotgun, it meant Logan would have to sit out the entirety of FP2 as the team rallied to repair the car. Again. Fortunately for him though, it looked as if the entire grid would be in the same boat. I actually woke up for FP2, only to find that the teams were worried about the little spits of rain falling from the clouds, and had thus decided therefore to take the afternoon off, besides a handful of exploratory laps late on in the hour. Danny Ric was obviously the worst casualty here, having already lost out the only meaningful running earlier on Friday. In a slightly better mood were Mercedes, who had apparently had the best first practice all year. Can't wait to see Lewis go out in Q1 later on then. So with Friday a washout, teams were eager to get some running in during FP3 before qualifying, Verstappen picking up where he left off and topping the timings with Perez in lukewarm pursuit. They did this whilst complaining about how horrible their RB20s felt, which bodes well for later on, doesn't it? Elsewhere, Mercedes continued to look better, topping the early running and ending the hour in P3 and P4 for Russell and Hamilton respectively. The same couldn't be said for McLaren, both drivers leaving some of their entrails on the exit of the second Degner at points in the session. I don't think anything else happened in that final practice hour, so let's skip straight to qualifying. Lance Stroll rolling back the years in Q1 and driving like a fetus as he failed to get out of the drop zone. Lance had been running the new upgrades throughout the weekend, with teammate Alonso only switching to the new package from Saturday onwards. Despite this, the two-time champ entered the session in P2. I don't need to say any more here, do I? The highlight of Q2 would be Daniel Ricciardo being slightly less than usual, very nearly breaking into the top 10 shootout before he was displaced by his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who progressed now for the second weekend in a row. Mullet Man had been performing pretty well so far too, ending the first part of quali in 8th place. He could only muster 13th on the grid in the second session, however. Still, could always be worse. You could be Guan Yu slow over here. With the top 10 now moving on into Q3, it was finally time to work out who would line up on the front row of the grid alongside Max Verstappen. It would actually end up being a surprise entry from the other Red Bull of Sergio Perez in the end, and that really shouldn't have been a sentence, should it? Still, credit where it's due, the Mexican narrowly missed out on pole after Verstappen gave everyone a chance on his final run, and Checo has finally got back onto that front row for the first time in almost a year. Wow, that's the second time I brought that up and it's still shocking. As for the rest of the grid, McLaren were best of the rest with Lando Norris in third. Meanwhile, Mercedes took their best weekend of 2024 to line up 7th and 9th. At least Hamilton outqualified his teammate this time. We've just got the race to go now, and I won't lie, if it sounds like I'm running on empty, it's because I spent my evening trying my luck at a casino and am now working off 2.5 hours sleep. On the bright side, I walked away with winnings totaling £14, which is about as much as I make off one of these before FOM butt-f***ed me with a copyright claim. Sorry, future will here, and that aged f***ing terribly, didn't it? Anyway, the 5 lights would go out, and Verstappen would cruise out into the lead. Elsewhere, Daniel Ricciardo shot up the order and into points contention. Sorry, no, I dozed off there for a minute. Instead, he did this. At least we now know when Daniel's dropped mid-season, he won't be taking a spot at Williams, the Aussie totaling yet another chassis as Alex Albon was tipped into the barrier as well. So as Ricciardo, Lawson and Sacked began trending on Twitter and Logan Sargent played hide-and-seek to stop James Vowles stealing his car again, I'm actually surprised I've been able to ramble on for this long without being interrupted by one of those stupid red flag memes. With the barriers fixed, we'd tried to go green once again. This time, Perez put in a little bit more effort into turn 1, and Nico Hülkenberg accidentally selected Mick Schumacher mode on his steering wheel at the launch. Actually, in hindsight, Mick Schumacher mode probably looks a little bit more like this. Elsewhere, the Alpines managed to collide, but realistically, neither of them were getting points anyway. After the opening lap, very little was going on towards the front, but the backmarker teams and Lance Stroll were making up for that at the rear of the field. The Grand Prix would then develop into a race of strategy, which is a polite way of saying it was a bit shit, but here we are. Lando Norris would be the first to pit, whilst the Mercedes cars opted to swap themselves around, a bit better than they did in Qatar 2023. That left #blessed to fend for himself against the charging Norris, who sent one around the outside of turn 1 to came 4th on the road. Hamilton being overtaken then became a bit of a theme, with Checo having just boxed also making his way through at 130R, and Carlos Sainz sticking one past his replacement for next year, which I'm sure felt good, even if Lewis was on hard tyres, more worn than the priest's wank rag. By this stage, Verstappen had already come into the pits and was so much quicker he'd been able to catch and pass Leclerc before the Monegasque chose to respond. Say hi, Max, because I doubt we'll be seeing you until lap 53 now. Let's focus on something a little bit more interesting. Say the battle for P11, for instance. 5 cars had just made it into the pits, with Yuki Tsunoda's RB crew pulling miracles and allowing the Japanese midget to jump 2 cars. Well, 1 car in the Sauber of Bottas, who actually had a decent stop for their standards, at 8 seconds long. I also thought Slow was having a poor stop until I realised his gearbox had just let itself go instead. Back at the front, Leclerc was trying to fend off Perez for second place, until the Ferrari driver lost control of that singular brain cell of his and went wandering off into the gravel trap at Degner 2. Logan Sargent decided that he would pick this moment to learn from one of the more experienced hands on the current grid, frustrating everyone watching when he could have brought out the safety car and made this race vaguely interesting for once. Tsunoda was putting on a show at least, slipping around the outside of Hulkenberg to get himself back into the points, and making the Japanese fans rather happy, I imagine. We were entering the end game by this point, and finally something was happening towards the front. Carlos Sainz had a fairly quiet race up to now, dropping back in the early stages thanks to his Ferrari strategy. This was paying off now though, scything his way past Norris, then his own teammate to secure himself a spot on the rostrum. The Mercedes drivers were also on the move, George Russell nearly crashing into the side of Piastri in the closing laps, though deciding against it once he realised there was no chance of a Sainz victory. That was because Verstappen had dominated once again from lights to flag. The Dutchman crossed the line to re-establish his grip on the World Championship, with Perez coming close-ish behind, ending up marking the first time in history that the championship has started with 4 consecutive 1-2 finishes, which is a rare stat for a comedy review, but there you go. To be fair, I think I slagged this race off a bit more than it deserved throughout this video, but that's only because my boy managed 3 corners before f***ing it and I still haven't properly slept yet. We got some decent action throughout, with some great moves in particular in the lower half of the field. Yuki Tsunoda ends up with my driver of the day, taking home more points for RB, and schooling the Alpines in the process. Let me know what you thought of this one down in the comments below and over in the poll on my community page. If you ended up enjoying the video, why not get subscribed, as I'll be covering every single race this season and whatever else I feel like when I could do with a little bit more money. Speaking of, a huge thank you goes out to my patrons and channel members for all of their constant support. They get my videos early, including sneak previews of these comedy reviews, so if that sounds enticing to you, head over to the links in this video's description to sign up. We've got another 2 weeks until China and yet more hours of sleep lost for me, but I'll have something coming out next week once I've just worked out exactly what that's going to be. Anyway, until then, have a good one.